Okay guys, in our last world history series we have discussed about Mussolini, and now here we are discussing about some important and interesting aspects. Here I am going to say that how sugar revolution, Cuba and communism. To say in one word, if you are asked that sugar is the center of Cuban communism, sugar was the center of Cuban diplomatic policy, sugar was the center of Cuban foreign policy. To right from the Spanish establishment of Spanish colony up to the Cold War, how sugar revolution, how the production of sugar maintain every aspect of Cuba. Okay, this is the question. Okay, how sugar was related to every aspect of Cuba right from the establishment of Spanish colony to the end of the Cold War. How sugar maintain every aspect of states in Cuba. Okay, this is the question. Okay, actually. Okay, and to find out the answer we have to go back. Number one, falling of Haiti, Haiti. Okay, falling of Haiti. What is Haiti? In that time, 18th and 19th century actually, Haiti was the center of sugar production. Okay, Haiti actually attracted all the sugar planters actually, and Haiti was famous for sugar cultivation. Okay, Haiti was famous for sugar cultivation, and most of the sugar in the colonial period was produced by the Haiti. Okay, but what happened? In France, Haiti was occupied by the French. Okay, French colony was established in Haiti. Okay, but after that, what happened? Haiti revolution came. The revolution of Haiti, the revolution of black people against the French colony, against the French actually changed the whole scenario, changed the whole background. Actually, what happened? The sugar production was centered around Haiti, but the revolution of Haiti actually broke this sugar industry in Haiti. Okay, then French colony was established in Haiti, and France monopolized all the sugar production. But the revolution of Haiti actually broke the revolution of sugar actually broke this sugar production and sugar industry. And as a result of this, what happened? Some people, some sugar planters, some sugar cultivators actually took refuge from Haiti in Cuba. Okay, mind this thing. Haiti was the first. Mind this link. Okay, Haiti was the center of sugar production. As a result of Haiti revolution, this sugar production, this sugar industry broke in Haiti. Then what happened? This sugar production actually shifted from Haiti to Cuba. Means that there were some sugar planters and sugar cultivators actually took refuge in Cuba, and they actually helped the Cuban planters to produce sugar. And already what happened? Spanish established colony in Cuba. Okay, then what happened? As a result of all these assimilating factors, a very big sugar industry actually began in Cuba, and this sugar industry was established in such a way that it became the center of economy in Cuba. It became the determining factor. It is said that the sugar in Cuba was the determining factor for all the factors, including foreign policy. Okay, so much importance of sugar was in the Cuban economy, Cuban polity. Then it is said that then as a result of this, what happened? First Haiti revolution occurred, and as after the Haiti revolution, the center of sugar production actually shifted from Haiti to Cuba. And what happened after that? Modernization of sugar industry happened. Okay, number one, modernization of sugar industry. Okay, number two, global sugar market. Okay, all these are factors, this modernization of sugar industry and this global sugar market. Okay, this was actually, these two elements were pushed by the Spanish colony. Okay, the sugar planters and sugar cultivators from Haiti took refuge in Cuba, and already Spanish also established their colony in Cuba. Okay, as a result of this, what happened? Spanish helped to modernization of sugar industry in Cuba, and as a result of this, a global sugar market was happened. Sugar market was developed in Cuba. Okay. Now see what happened. Then another important factor is that as a result of the development of sugar industry in Cuba, Cuba became a center of slave trade. Okay, for the for workers in sugar production, okay, in sugar factory, in sugar plantation, okay, the slaves were traded. Slaves were brought from around this area, from Africa, from other areas to Cuba. Cuba became a center of slave trade and slave assemblies. Then there are some, it is said that, and what are the impact of this sugar revolution? It can be said one way, a sugar revolution in Cuba. What are the impact of sugar revolution in Cuba? Number one, from a small farm to large plantation, from free to slave labor, from sparse to dense population, or from white to black population. What have you seen? Now we have seen that how sugar controlled the social atmosphere of Cuba. Okay, first there was a free slave. Okay, there is not importance of slave, but as a result of sugar industry happened, the slave trade begin. Okay, the society was transformed. Okay, slave labor came into Cuba. Okay, society was transformed, and different bonds and different contracts were placed there. Okay, from free to slave labor occurs, and the population increased. Okay, means what was the impact of the sugar industry, sugar revolution in Cuba? First we have seen that slave labor happened in Cuba. Okay, then society was transformed, population increased. In this way, in the first phase actually, in this way, sugar revolution actually influenced the whole society. Okay, sugar revolution influenced the whole society and economy of Cuba. Okay, right from Haiti, sugar industry actually transformed to Cuba. Okay, Cuba, and in the establishment of Spanish colony in Cuba actually helped a very large in evolving a very large global sugar market. Okay, and when the global sugar market developed in Cuba, slaves came from all the areas to Cuba. As a result of this, society was transformed. Okay, in this way, in the first phase we have seen how sugar transformed the societal foundation in Cuba. Okay, in the first phase we have seen then how sugar transformed the societal structure of Cuba. Now in this second phase we will see how sugar how this sugar was the center of conflict between Cuba and Spanish, because you see it was a sugar that attracted the Spanish. Okay, and day by day what happened? Spanish influence was increased in Cuba because of the production of sugar. Okay, I already told you sugar was the center of economy in Cuba that determined all the political aspects as well as economic affairs. Okay, and another most noticeable factor is that day by day USA was growing to USA was increasing its influence in Cuba, and day by day over dominating Spain. USA began to develop its relation in Cuba and began to dominate all the spheres in Cuba, and USA day by day became the largest importer of sugar from Cuba, and as a result of this, all the American investment, all the American companies and all the American industries began to center and establish in Cuba. Okay, now what happened, you see, for the attraction of sugar industry attracted Spanish. Sugar industry was developed by Spanish. As a result of this, Spanish influence increased in Cuba. Okay, on the other hand, American influence was also established in Cuba, and all and another way what happened, the Cuban people were actually unsatisfied with Spanish rule. Okay, they began to express their patriotism. Okay, patriotism actually developed day by day actually. Okay, patriotism actually developed day by day, and what happened, Cuban people wanted to overthrow the Spanish rule. Okay, and as a result of this, what happened, Cuban War of Independence happened, and in this phase actually what happened, Cuba actually fought many wars against Spain. Among the three wars are 10 years war, little war. Okay, 10 years war, little war, and in both these two wars, 10 years war and little war, in both these two wars actually Cuba actually failed to expel Spanish from Cuban land. Then another was on the what happened, there was a growing antagonism between America and Spanish with Cuba. Okay, America was jealous on the growing influence of Cuba in economic sphere, and on the other hand, Spanish was also jealous on the growing influence of America in Cuban economy. As a result of this conflict happened also between Spanish and America, and as a result of this war happened, Spanish and American war happened, and in this war America actually expelled Spain from Cuba, and American established their dominance over Cuba. And at this stage what happened again, after Spain, America became the center of economic and political sphere in Cuba. It is the second phase. Okay, now we see how sugar was the center of Cuban society, Cuban economy and Cuban polity. In first stage what happened, sugar in the production attracted Spanish colony, and Spanish become the center of sugar production. Okay, now after the expulsion of Spanish, in the second phase what happened, sugar production attracted American expelled Spain from Cuba, and in this second phase America was the center of all political and economic sphere in Cuba. And in both these two phases we have seen that sugar was the integral factor in Cuba that attracted Spanish and America. Okay. Now in the third phase what happened, we see that America expelled Spanish from Cuba, and now America became all the dominating factor in Cuba. Okay, now US-based government was established in Cuba, and it was President Macedo Morel. I don't know what's the actual pronunciation, but his name is Machado Morale, Morel. Okay, and he actually became a very cruel dictator. Okay, now in third phase what happened, we see that American expelled Spain from Cuba, and America became the all dominating factors in Cuba. Cuba was full of American investment, American industry. Okay, and all the American companies were established in Cuba. Okay, in one way America was the controlling factor in all spheres in Cuba. Okay, and the Cuban president, backed by America, Macedo Morel, and he actually in turn became a very cruel dictator. Okay, and in the third phase what happened, in the first phase we see that when Spain controlled every sphere in in Cuba, then people were revolted against the Spanish. And in the third phase also the same thing happened. When America dominated all the factors, all the aspects in Cuba, then people also became disgusted with this. Okay, and then what happened, some reformers actually began revolt against the government of Morel. Okay, and one such reformer was Batista, Batiste. Okay, then Batista, what did do to and one another thing I forgot to mention in this thing, in this line, that when America expelled Spain from Cuba, then Cuba signed an amendment or agreement with America. It was Platt Amendment. P-L-A-T, Platt, A-M-E-N-D, Platt Amendment. According to Platt Amendment, USA has a right to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs, and Cuba will lease an area for a naval base in Cuba. and as a result of this, what happened? US economic involvement weakened. Cuba became more independent on USA, and economic involvement the economic involvement of USA weakened Cuba, and as a result of this amendment, Cuba became more independent on USA. After when America expelled Spain from Cuba, then Cuba signed an agreement with America. According to this amendment, the USA has a full right to intervene in Cuba's internal affairs, and Cuba will leave an area for establishing naval base by US. Okay, as a result of these factors, Cuba became more independent on USA. Okay, and how all these things happen? Because of sugar industry. Okay, mind this thing. Here the central theme is sugar. Okay, now in this way, there are two factors again. Okay, the USA people are disgusted with US independence day by day. Okay, and another was the US backed cruel dictator Maceo Morel. Okay, because of these two factors, actually revolt happened against revolt occurred against government, okay, Cuban government, and one such rebel, actually he was Batista, and Batista actually overthrew the government of Morel, and he also has been able to overthrow the US military base from Cuba. And again, thus another phase began in Cuban history. It was the phase of the government of Batista. Okay, it was the third. It again a new phase happened. The overthrowing the government of US-backed Morel. Batista came into power, and he established government in Cuba. Okay. Till now, what we have seen? Till now, we have seen that in first phase, sugar and transformation of Cuban society. Okay, the falling of Haiti shifted the base of sugar industry from Haiti to Cuba. Okay, and it transformed the societal structure in Cuba. In second phase, we have seen that sugar and Cuban war of independence. Growing independence of Spanish actually disgusted the Cuba, and Cuban people wanted independence. They would begin war against the Spanish, but they failed. But along with the sensing time, actually what happened? America expelled Spanish from Cuba and began to control all the industry in Cuba. Thus, in the second phase, we see how sugar is related with the war of independence, and how sugar is related also with the growing influence of America in Cuba. And in the third phase, we have seen that US dominance and Maceo Morel. In third phase, what we have seen, after expelling Spanish from Cuba, USA signed Platt Amendment with Cuba. According to this amendment, actually, according to this amendment, USA has full right to intervene in any internal affairs on Cuba. Okay, and USA military base was established in Cuba. It is the third phase, US dominance and Maceo Morel. Okay, but along with the growing, but after that, what happened? He was a dictator. But that is why again revolt happened against the influence of America and against the dictator Morel. But in the after third phase, actually in this phase, what happened? Batista came, another rebel came into power. Okay, Batista, what did they do? Batista overthrew the government of Morel, and he established, and he also expelled US military base from Cuba. Okay, but after that, what happened? Batista was also more or less influenced by American government. Okay, because America was dominating all the factors in Cuba so much way, especially due to sugar revolution. Okay, America was the largest importer of sugar from Cuba. Okay, until and unless Cuba find an alternative to export sugar in another country, Cuba must have to be independent on America, because the sugar was the economy of the Cuba. Okay, if the relationship between Cuba and America deteriorated, then America will stop sugar. Okay, America will stop importing sugar from Cuba, and Cuban economy will be what? Cuban economy will be broken totally. Okay, Cuban economy will be totally downturn. Okay, that is why in this fourth phase also the government of Batista also more or less influenced by America, means American influence still became a dominating factor in Cuba because of sugar industry during the reign of Batista also. As a result of this, the purpose of Batista to overthrow American influence was failed. But the most dominating and important factor is that this Batista was very much cruel and brutal ruler. Okay, that is why what happened again, revolt occurred during the time during the reign of Batista. Why? Because he was a dictator. In which way Batista revolted against the Morel. Okay, in this people again revolted against the Batista. The reason are always two, because first he was a dictator, okay, and another was the growing influence of America. People did not want to be dependent on America much more. Okay, that is why because of these two reasons against the revolt happened. And in this phase, who will come into power? The most charismatic leader, Fidel Castro, will come into power in Cuba. Okay, overthrowing the government of Batista, Fidel Castro occupied power in this fourth phase in Cuba. And now what happened when Fidel Castro came into power? He was a very exceptional ruler, charismatic leader actually. Okay, then during the initial period, at first he was a liberal nationalist, he was a social democratic. Okay, and that is why America was not so worried about him. Okay, but gradually what happened? Fidel Castro began to nationalize all the US bank, all the US investment, and all the US property in Cuba. He seized all US property and turned into Cuban property. Okay, means he nationalized all the Cuban American investment, American business, American property, American companies. Okay, but at that time what happened? I already told you how sugar dominated the economy of Cuba. Okay, until and unless Cuba find an alternative to import sugar, Cuba cannot take any independent foreign policy. Okay, but in this phase what happened when Cuba began to nationalize the property of America? Then America warned that if Cuba did not stop this, then America will stop importing sugar from Cuba. Again, see how sugar became a dominant factor. Okay, then what happened? At that moment there was no alternative for Cuba to change this road. Actually, that is why Cuba was not totally able to nationalize all the American property in Cuba, because if America stopped import of sugar from Cuba, then Cuba economy will fall down. Okay, that is why what happened? Cuba had not been able to nationalize all these things, all this US property, but already the relationship between Cuba and America deteriorated. Okay, but at that moment, a very charismatic, this charismatic leader actually able to develop a very good relation with USSR. Okay, USSR was a communist leader. Okay, and gradually what happened? Cuba, this Fidel Castro was actually influenced by communist ideology, and he also wanted to turn whole Cuba into a communist regime. And as a result of this, what happened? Relationship developed between Cuba and USSR. Okay, see how interesting the thing is. Then when Cuba found an alternative country to import sugar from Cuba, then already Cuba, what happened? Cuba stopped and Cuba stopped its relation with America, and Cuba, and this whole sugar was actually now imported to USSR instead of America. That is why what happened? USA stopped its all diplomatic relations with Cuba, and Cuba began its new relation with USSR. USSR began to import all the sugar from Cuba, and USSR not only in sugar, USSR also tried to help Cuba from all ways. Okay, USSR actually aided Cuba all way, and Cuba became a communist regime now. Okay, and Cuba and USSR, relationship between Cuba and USSR developed, and a relationship between Cuba as well as USSR and USA became deteriorated. Now it is the time of Cold War. Okay, and we all know who was Cold War. The first one is communist regime and another is democratic. Okay, one is USA, one way it is USA, and on the other hand it was USSR. Okay, the Cold War happened. Okay, and during the Cold War, what happened? America was very much fear. Okay, America was very much fear against this communist regime. Okay, and that is why that is why America actually America Central Investigation Agency of America. Okay, Central Investigation Agency, Central Intelligence Agency of America actually aided. Actually, Central Intelligence Agency aided some rebels actually. Okay, America actually incited some rebels to protest against Cuba. Okay, but the situation deteriorated so much that at one moment happened when a military revolt funded by US Central Intelligence Agency tried to defeat Fidel Castro. It is called Bay of Pigs invasion. The US aided military actually began invasion from Guatemala. Okay, but this revolt was this US aided revolt was actually defeated by Fidel Castro. It is called Bay of Pigs invasion. Now what happened? It is, we all know what is Cuban Missile Crisis. USSR, what happened? Cuba was always fear against America. Cuba always thought that America might intervene in Cuba's internal affairs in future. That is why what happened? Cuba requested USSR, its strong ally, to establish missile base in Cuba. And USSR actually what happened? Established missile regime ballistic missile regime in Cuba. Okay, and along with this nuclear based missile also base was also established in Cuba. And as after that what happened, America's United States actually spy actually caught this act, and there was great hue and cry arose. Okay, then America was very fear about this thing. Okay, because USSR was developing missile in Cuba. Okay, it is called Cuban Missile Crisis or October Crisis. Okay, then after that what happened? Agreement was signed between America and USSR. USSR promised that the USSR will dismantle all the missile developed in Cuba and return back to USSR. Okay, and secretly it was also agreed that America will also dismantle all the missile and all the weapons that she established in Turkey against socialist regime, against any probable mismatch in future of by socialist regime. Okay, now these are the main things, the important things in Cold War related to Cuba. One is October Revolution or Cuban Missile Crisis, and another is what happened, Bay of Pigs invasion. Okay, but the thing is that in all this Cold War sphere also the diplomatic policy was determined by sugar. Because what happened? What was the reason? If Cuba was not independent on any country, because why? Cuba's sugar was also sugar was the main dominating factor in Cuba. Okay, that is why until and unless Cuba found an ally to import sugar, she always remained dependent on others. Okay, she refused when Cuba found an ally like USSR, then she stopped exporting sugar from Cuba to America. Now USSR imported all sugar from Cuba. Okay, now we have seen that in Cold War area also sugar was the main dominating factor in Cuba that determined her diplomatic policy. Now what we have seen that in first page, sugar and transformation of Cuban society. Okay, here we have to mention how shifting of sugar industry from Haiti to Cuba influenced the economy and society, influenced the society of Cuba. In the second phase we have seen that sugar and Cuban War of Independence. Here we have to mention how growing sugar trade actually attracted Spanish. Okay, how Spanish become influenced. Okay, on the other hand, how America also began its step in Cuban sugar industry, and how Cuban people revealed their disappointment against Spanish, and how with taking this advantage actually USA influenced the Cuban economy. Okay, how America took hold of the Cuban sugar industry, how America became the largest exporter of sugar from Cuba. Okay, and after that how America became the how America became the dominating factor in Cuba, okay, by importing sugar, and how America established its how America established government in Cuba also. Okay, then after that we have seen that how USA dominance was established after expelling Spain from Cuba. Okay, how USA signed Path agreement. Okay, and how Mr. Morel was government was supported by USA. Okay, then after that we have to mention and we have seen that how Morel was overthrown and Batista came into power. Okay, then after that we have seen that how Fidel Castro came into power, overthrowing Batista. Okay, and how sugar was a very dwindling factor in front of Fidel Castro also. Okay, and after that when Fidel Castro found an ally to export sugar from Cuba to USSR, then how she stopped all relations with America. Okay, in this way you have to describe how sugar was the most dominating and intrinsic factor in Cuba, how sugar was related to Cuban Revolution of Independence, how sugar was related with Cuban communism. Okay, how sugar was related with Cuban economy. Okay, in this way you have to write all these things in your answer. Okay, hope you are helpful, and in our next chapter lecture we will come again another topic. Till then, take care. Bye bye.